Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of the Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson. Today is Wednesday, May 27th, 2020. I know you're all sick and tired of hearing this from me, but I'm sick and tired of having to say it. I know that since this ridiculous lockdown, the economy is beginning its implosion, and everything has fallen off. Most people's income, unless you work for the public school system or some other institution like that, and that includes my own. I desperately need a new computer. My car has 300,000 miles on it. I wouldn't mind going to see a dentist. And for those who haven't assisted me, even in a small amount, but I've gotten something out of this, I ask you please, at least one time, to help me out if you can. If you're suffering because of this lockdown, then certainly not. My website, which I never mention, is rusjournal.org, rusjournal.org. And there, among other places, you can find the PayPal donation button. And no, I have yet to receive my stimulus check, either in paper or in electronic form. I do fully, I don't take any tax exemption whatsoever. I never will. My tax stuff is all in order. So this has to have some other cause, but I know I'm not the only one who is in this boat. Although I don't know anyone who's in this boat, I know, at least I assume, it's happening. My website has not all my essays, but a representative sample, those that aren't going into books or have gone into books. Links to get my books, including the latest two. One published by my friends, the Russia Insider, at least with their assistance anyway, Ukrainian Nationalism. Very simple title. I deal with the history of that subject from roughly the time of Hetman Mazepa to roughly just the beginning of the Ukrainian Civil War. And then, of course, the Soviet experiment published by the Barnes Review earlier this year. And the Russia Insider people have also helped reprint older works, including my book on something that has not been dealt with by our people whatsoever, ever, and that is the military governments of Latin America during the Cold War. Who these people are, and how great they were. Most of them were. And in fact, the myth that the U.S. ever supported them, whatever support means, and that Washington, wanted them to fight communism, which is utter nonsense. Most of these guys were condemned. I have all the CIA paperwork showing that they were being condemned. Pinochet wasn't even allowed in the U.S. Anyway, last week, I did part one of my ideas on Montenegro. I have a book out on Serbia that I wrote right after I left Liberty Lobby, in the Barnes Review. At least as full-time employment, I'm still with them. I'm still senior researcher for the Barnes Review. I'm very proud to be a part of it, and I endorse it 100%. Back when I was editor there, as soon as they went bankrupt and I had to go, I became a professor at Mount St. Mary's, and then I also wrote that book on Serbia. I only touched on Montenegro. And I'm realizing just what an omission that is. And where I ended last time, now this is part 2, we may go to part 3, I have the feeling we will go to part 3. But I ended in the middle of a discussion about the great St. Peter I of St. Peter I Petrovich, at the very end of the 18th century. And this is, this man is a saint, of course, a monarch and bishop. It was a theocracy in Montenegro. And I quoted him, and I wanted to contrast it to what modern Orthodox clerics say today. Last week we talked about their fight against the Turks, the Albanian treason, and everything that Montenegro was, essentially a Serbian Cossack almost. So St. Peter, the king and bishop or metropolitan of Montenegro, Satinia, is one of the rare cases where, these canons, these Byzantine canons reflect Byzantine experience, and they're not always applicable. Now, the dogmatic canons are a separate issue. They're always applicable. But the other disciplinary ones aren't necessarily universal, depending on circumstances. And these are saintly men, so clearly, it's legitimate. But St. Peter I and II, both saints, both thought exactly the same, are fanatical Orthodox nationalists to the point where even I can't match it. Let me give you another example. As they were getting ready to fight the Turks, that same battle I mentioned last time, it's the battle 1796, as this is before the Serbian Revolution, which started in 1804. And here's what he says about this battle against the Turkish and Albanian occupiers. St. Peter says, "The enemy comes to challenge our strong men with their bloodthirsty might. The time has come for a brave, glorious, and dignified protection of our national freedom that our blessed ancestors defended. Your proven bravery, shown at Martinsini, which is the earlier battle, convinces me that you will be even fiercer and braver in this new struggle. Your muscles are already hardened by wading through the river of Turkish blood. Enemies have become enraged like wild lynxes, but in you breathes the powerful spirit of bravery and knighthood. Attack the enemy of our faith and our dearest Serb nation. Show glorious knights by this day that we will leave as an eternal memory for our descendants. Today with joy. Our comrades and friends expect to hear about your valiant deeds crowned by a wreath of victory. Then they will compose songs. They'll make wreaths of glory for you. Do not calculate the cost. Be united more than ever against our common foe and do whatever dignifies our national name. You know that Turks have been always frightened of Montenegrins. Now they're frightened of Serbian knights, incapable of forsaking their fatherland and returning home ashamed." Does any of that sound like modern Christianity? Does any of it sound like your modern Orthodox cleric? Of course not. If an Orthodox man were to talk like this today, talk like me, he will be condemned. He'll be called every name in the book. He'll be kicked out of every church. And yet these are great saints, actually the greatest saints of Montenegro, who are talking like this. The well-fed bishops of our Western world wouldn't know what to do with this. The absurd robber synod of 1870, the so-called Philotism synod. Well, no one accepted it at the time except Constantinople. Everyone was in communion with the Exarchate. So, of course, at the time, everyone thought it was a robber synod. Until, of course, they suffered with their own separatist problems. Suddenly, they dust it off and start using it. And the Moscow Patriarchate used it against Ukraine many times, although they were in communion with the Exarchate right up till the end. So people like the bishop rulers of Montenegro, Peter I and Peter II, among many others, are a standing confrontation with the modern world. And this is why the Patriarch of Constantinople, which has about as much legitimacy in the Orthodox world as my cat Stanley, who is about a foot from me, as he always is, canonized Maria of Paris. Now, I'm not saying anything about her as an ascetic. She may have been wonderful, but there's lots of wonderful ascetics at any given time. But because she was a far leftist, she worked for the French Resistance, which was a communist front. She was canonized in a purely political canonization to make it okay to be one of these people that was canonized. The Masonic Fanar canonized her solely to challenge people like me and those in Russia and elsewhere who are doing doing God's work here. And I want to take a minute to point out, and I don't want to beat up on these guys. The former Synod of Resistance, Metropolitan Cyprian was a very good man. Despite, we all have, none of us are perfect. The thing with Auxentius was sinful. They're rejecting him. He was a saintly man. Everyone knows that. They split from him, embarrassed him, assaulted him. Then the minute he dies and is out of the way, they rehabilitate him. Again, I don't want to say that these people have no grace because of it. That's not how grace works. Grace doesn't work through bishops. Grace works within bishops like everyone else. They're not special in that regard. But years ago, I remember reading their plea to immigration. And the article was called "And Who Was My Neighbor?" written by Metropolitan Cyprian, who otherwise was a very good man, who condemns the nationalist Church of Greece at the time for rejecting mass immigration. Now, this is, of course, before the immigration battle more recently, allegedly from the so-called Syrian civil war. But Cyprian condemns the Greek nationalist movement, claiming that these immigrants are all legitimate, I don't know how he knows this, are legitimate refugees from persecution. He doesn't give any details, and therefore we have an obligation. Well, if that was true, certainly that would be the case. We have no objective, unlimited obligation to them, even if it's legitimate. But he seems to think it's true. And then the odd thing is, Cyprian usually is a very thorough scholar. He cites people like St. Gregory Palamas. And the citations that he uses have nothing to do with the topic. You know, it's odd when you have, this happens quite often. You have very good writers and holy people who they have to take a position that they'd rather not take, and they sound foolish because they're forcing an argument that they wouldn't make. He cites St. Gregory talking about miracles occurring amongst the Turks, as if that's relevant to the issue at hand. Of course God works among, who's saying otherwise? But then he even cites the international obligations through treaty that he condemns the Greek church for fighting. The odd thing is, dishonesty when they'll define the term that they dislike any way they want, usually in the harshest vocabulary, and then pat themselves on the back for opposing it. We oppose immigration from the third world into Europe, especially into the Balkans, because they're Muslims. They're doing what the Turkish arms failed to do. They're not seeing that this is a war. It's a very pandering kind of article, and I strongly doubt his people will agree with it. And again, those guys are decent. I don't have any personal problem with them. Or I should say, I don't know maybe I do. I don't have any ideological or theological problem with them. But if this is representative, then that will change. But I've never seen anything else like this from them. But it's just really, just out of nowhere, this extreme liberal idea, forgetting that they're still at war. Just because, the Balkans is at least formally free, which of course it is not, but it's free from immediate Turkish control. It doesn't mean that this mass immigration, also of Islamic people, mostly young males of military age, strangely enough, who should be building their own countries at home, are being directed towards the Balkans, yet again, with the exact same bankers, the Fanar, who were Jewish, Greek, and to a lesser extent Armenian, who were financing it then. The oligarchs in Venice were trading with the Muslims, and having deals with them just at the time the resistance was collapsing, and profited from them. This is now. So, they'll extol the virtues of those who fought the Turkish occupation and yet welcome these migrants today. And all they're doing is what the Turkish guns failed to do many years ago. Anyway, the first half of the 19th century, the economy of Montenegro didn't change very much. I mean, livestock remained the central element of the economy. They began to import potatoes because St. Peter had brought them from Russia. Internal trade was modest, and it was a clan-based society. Although they're all Serbs, they're all Orthodox, they had these extended families, which the local politics was based on. The patriarchs would be the main economic actors. It was not a monetized society, so you at the time didn't have much inequality. It really was only later that the construction of roads began. And once modern roads began to be laid, everything changed. Then you had monetization, then you had debt, then you had banks, then you had inequality, then you had class, then you had modern bureaucracy, then you had repression. That's how it seems to work. Now, St. Peter II ruled until 1851. What these guys tried to do, we talked last time about the drive to centralize and formalize the society, largely for military purposes. The clan system was okay. It certainly won many victories, but Montenegro was very small. At the time, maybe 5 figures. Today, maybe it's about the size of Wyoming in terms of population. But it's pretty clear that the underlying unity of these mountain Serbs was being drawn out. St. Peter II also crushed the blood feud, which was never a Christian practice, and really sapped the energy. It's like in Rome or anywhere else, the minute you get involved in civil wars, the army starts eating itself, external enemies are going to take over. The bishop ruler, Montenegro, began to concentrate more power to himself, which of course was minimal to begin with given the nature of the society. The problem with doing that, as necessary as it was, is that when someone else takes over, he now has a ready-made system that he could rule from. Later on, though, modernity comes to Montenegro and almost destroyed it, as it always does. No one ever voted on any of this. It's imposed on us. Danilo or Daniel II. This is where now the bishop ruler starts to break down, and of course he falls in love with a woman somewhere. We know what love really means. He left the monastic life, what a shock. Then he altered the constitution to satisfy this provoked desire. So in 1855, a new code was written. He became kind of a European-style prince. So now gone were the days when church and state were united in the person of the prince-bishop, making Montenegro extremely prosperous and free under the worst of circumstances. Now, of course, it's just becoming another European country. And the minute he does this, you now have, for the first time, real internal dissent. Modernity and the growing money economy created classes for the very first time. That means passions become inflamed. Envy is provoked. But still, it wasn't enough to harm the martial spirit of the time. The Turkish army was smashed in 1858 at Grahovo. And then, because of this, and of course, the other nations of the Balkans are doing damage as well, the London oligarchs begin to worry. That's when they begin to prop up the Islamic Empire to keep Orthodoxy from rising in the Balkans, especially the Russian influence. There is nothing that London oligarchs, the Fanar, wouldn't do to keep Russia from having influence in the Balkans. This is what the so-called Philotism Council was aimed at. It was destroying the rise of the Slavs on the backs of the rotting Turkish colonial state, which the Fanar bankers continued to serve. But this is so-called civilization. It means the rise of classes, sin, passion, hatred. As roads and schools became formalized, Montenegro became weaker. The minute you monetize the economy and centralize it, debt then is used as a weapon. And oligarchs, often foreign, convinced local chieftains that money was their route to power. So Danilo II, who altered the constitution to suit himself, brought this tiny country into the so-called modern age as a monument to his libido. And temperately agrees with me, as he demanded the creation of a modern bureaucracy that automatically means corruption, money, oligarchy was the result. So the formerly free warrior people began to see the serfdom of debt, and if they were the creditors, it served them just fine. Capitalism in the merchant mindset was able to do what the Turk couldn't. The moment the Turkish danger was gone, modernity rotted to the core, the nation from within. The government of Prince Danilo was characterized, of course, by centralization, obsessions with efficiency, for better or for worse, the notion of a modern monarchy, which of course means its own destruction. The Code of Danilo I, the Assembly of Chiefs and Elders in the capital in 1855, 95 articles which regulated everything. The destruction of what they call the patriarchal way of life was complete. The independence of the tribe was destroyed, which has both positive and negative results. But the old ways did put up a battle. For the first time, 4 revolts broke out. Papirian, 1852, one in 1854, Akushi in 1855, and again the next year. Everything was brutally put down. The greatest suffering was imposed in the town of Kushi. About 200 people were killed. 13 villages were set on fire. This was to impose modernism, which has always been imposed by force and violence. No one ever wants this stuff. The oligarchy with money needs essentially the entire economy centralized and as a laboratory for their desires. So of course Danilo paid attention to the organization of the army and the police, which is one of the first things these guys have to do as they begin to centralize power and classes begin to form. But in 1853, he organized a so-called Crusader army, about 10,000 men. But for the first time in a long time, actually the first time ever, he feared his own people. For the first time, the prince had a bodyguard, this time of 1,000 elite soldiers. This all, before that, they had nothing of the kind. The minute money gets involved, they all of a sudden need to be protected. Of course, they will sell it today as the creation of a single Montenegrin economic space. And partially they introduced customs duties, which is a way of demarcating their country as a single entity, which is legitimate from a philosophical point of view, but unfortunately it meant the invasion of foreign money. So Montenegrin products were protected from Austrian goods from the coastal cities. But the problem is customs duties were farmed out, so it became a source of income and another factor for property differentiation. But here's what Temperley says in 1917. The Montenegrin of the interior at bottom cares little what administration and administrative efficiency may be. He resents external interference. He loathes the machinery of syndicates, exploiters, financial agents, and capitalists who introduce civilization. He cares almost equally little for the liberal constitution granted by the king in 1905. What he wishes to do is live quietly on his plot of land, to wander over his mountains free and armed as of old, listen to the old ballads of the Guslar over the hearthstone, to teach his children the sword dance of winter evenings. Such a man likes Nikita far better for having played on the gooseslip before announcing his declaration of war on Turkey in 1912 than for all the benefits the king has brought to his country. Now, we're talking about a slightly later period, but the exact same process was going on. Simply saying this is not the Montenegrin way. The notion of personal freedom is violently opposed by the modern world. They use the rhetoric. But modernity is based on force. Not force necessarily of the rifle or the sword, but money, social shame, sexual liberation, the promotion of the passions. This is how cultures are turned into the empty husks called civilizations. Again, Temperley says, certainly until the present war, he's writing this at the end of World War I, King Nicholas of Montenegro had cause for pride when he looked back at Montenegro as it was in 1860. His reign began with a series of defeats, and the Turks as of old moved up the valleys and severed the mountain from Brda, which was their northern hinterland. Yet 1875-76, the prince was not afraid to declare war against the Turks. After a checkered campaign, he inflicted immense losses on them, eventually captured several major cities and drove the Ottomans forever from the Vale of the Zeta, which is the old name for Montenegro. Now, the details of the Treaty of Berlin in 1878 and subsequent modifications we don't have to deal with, but he says eventually the independence of Montenegro was formally recognized. The point is that, and he just said that this same centralization that he's supposed to look back and pride on was not Montenegrin, and in fact sucked the very life out of the country. They were still capable of tremendous victories, and there was some necessity for the centralization of power and the ending of the blood feud. Unfortunately, it came at the cost of the soul of the nation. So nationalism, national socialism, social royalism, all these different ideologies. National socialism is a very broad ethno-national ideal found all over the world. But in the 20th century, it became a desperate attempt to revitalize the older spirit of the nation, of the Balkans and everywhere else. Now, Germany had tremendous success in the Second and the Third Reich. Modernity will still force itself on the world in the name of freedom. Of course, freedom is always presented in the abstract. He says again, and this is now about King Nicholas, a bit later, but it's the same ideology. In the more ambitious scheme of securing the leadership of the Serbian race for himself in Montenegro, King Nikola failed. This is the ideal which seems to be presented in Montenegro in the king's drama, The Empress of the Balkans. And in view, the past glory of Zeta and Montenegro is one which is entirely legitimate. Unfortunately, it's no longer possible for the very history of Montenegro itself and the services which it has rendered to the Serb race make it now necessary for her to surrender these claims. So long as the kingdom of Serbia was weak and divided, and a vassal of Austria, so long Montenegro stood for all that was best of the past, the heroic freedom of the Serb race. But when Serbia showed herself armed and strong, conquered Turkey, crushed Bulgaria, and defied Austria, Montenegro's part became not that of a leader, but of an ally. Now we're moving into a different era here, from the middle of the 19th century to the 20th. In the last few months before the war, King Nikola practically agreed to a peaceful economic and political union with Serbia. This becomes a big issue later. Oligarchs throughout the world are terrified of this idea. These countries might be small, but as we just read, they're extremely powerful. The size of the nation has absolutely no bearing on their victories. It's the cohesiveness of the nation that matters. This is universally a fact. But if any agreement ever became effective, at all events, it's now certain that Montenegro, at the time, really could only survive as a part of Serbia. And then they don't have to worry about this internal centralization. And this was a debate in roughly 1917. So by the early 20th century, Montenegro maintained a fairly prosperous economy. Austria-Hungary, of course, was almost a replacement colonial power from the Turks. The Serbs minted, or the Montenegrins minted their purple, which was pinned to the Austrian Krona, which was introduced in 1893 with the introduction of the gold standard. But unfortunately, this meant that Montenegro ran a huge trade deficit. Her exports were about 2.3 million peppers versus 8.1 million imports. So again, the rise of classes, the rise of dependency, self-interest, corruption. It shouldn't surprise you that the capital, the Italian oligarchs, which still existed, even though this is now United Italy, was significant. And loans and aid from Russia helped pay the bills. So whether, this centralization, now that it happened, the only way out is now to join with Serbia. Prince Nikola took over and ruled Montenegro after the centralization of Danilo II was a done deal. But he was successful. Successes in war, huge increase in the state territory, international recognition. It did raise the prince's reputation. And there's nothing like military victory to secure your position on the throne. We talked about Stepan Mali last time. The very strange circumstances, but once he won battles, it didn't matter what he was. But Nikola didn't want to give anything over to Serbia, despite the fact that they're one people. Different circumstances, but one people. My favorite Serbian monarch, Milan Obrenović, who died in 1901. Relations between Montenegro and Serbia weren't very good. Nikola would not give up his ambition. He wanted to be leader of all Serbs, not just Montenegrins. But it was too small to have any kind of priority. But of course, good relations were maintained with Russia. Prince Nikola had two daughters, married into the family of Nicholas II. In 1910, a military agreement was concluded, and the Russians came in to equip and train the Montenegrin army. And they agreed not to engage in any military operations without Russian consent. But in 1911, 1912, they ignored this. But at that time, Montenegro entered into an alliance with Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece for the final end of Turkish presence in the Balkans. It's upsetting that a lot of these same Muslims have now been invited back, now that the monarchy is gone. The nationalists lost in World War II. The bankers take over, rule as a disguised and now blatantly open oligarchy. And like always, they bring in foreigners. This is why oligarchies always used mercenaries. But as it turns out, with Britain, that was their greatest foe, not the Turks. Because by now, we're talking, the time of the Balkan Wars, the very beginning of World War I, Turkey should have died a long time ago, but Britain would do anything to keep Russia out of the Balkans and therefore was propping up the country militarily and economically. We talked about this in many other lectures over the last 10, 12 years. The army could field roughly 30,000 men. But here, we're still in the 20th century and Turkey hasn't left. Montenegro was essential. Despite having only a handful of people, she was critical in driving the Turks out. The bankers throughout the world didn't like this idea because Russia was not under their thumb. Now, of course, the Albanians that were Muslims sided with Turkey. The minority Christian Albanians, who were mostly Orthodox under the Greek Church, sided with Montenegro. So when I say Albanian, I'm referring to Muslims only. But the great powers, with the exception of Russia, all fought Montenegro. Fear of Russia was the factor. So all of a sudden, the controlled press in Britain was extolling Islam and recognizing Albania as this ancient ethnic group. But even after Skadar was cleared of Turks, roughly in 1913, foreign occupiers from other countries quickly moved in. The Balkan Wars, Montenegro did very, very well, but other countries came in and took the credit and the resources. By now, Montenegro was roughly 9,000 square miles and annexed several important towns because of all this. But during the First World War, Serbia and Montenegro were allies of Russia, France, and Great Britain, most unfortunately against Austria-Hungary, who I've written many, many times is the culprit that started World War I. I've explained that many times on my website and 1,000 other places. After the occupation of Serbia and Montenegro by the end of 1916, the question of the Union of Montenegro and Serbia became very important. There was a committee of the Union of Montenegro and Serbia was founded in France right after the war, and the Serbian government, of course, was a major financer of this committee. Once the war was over, the Union of Montenegro and Serbia was settled in 1918 after the breach of the front of Salonika and the victorious advance of the Serbian allied armies for the liberation not only of Serbia and Montenegro, but all the South Slavs held by Austria-Hungary in preparation for what we call now the Assembly of Podgorica, besides the previously formed Montenegrin Committee for the Union of Montenegro and Serbia. After the liberation of Montenegro, local government was established in all areas, all communities really, but without the participation of the Serbian army. By the end of the war, fall of 1918, members of the temporary executive central committee arrived in Montenegro. The first national gatherings had it in Peš and really parts of the Serbian province of Kosovo and Metohija, and all major Montenegrin towns. And elections were held. And now you had two factions form. You had followers of King Nikola, who were opposed to the union with Serbia, and were, not surprisingly, financed by Italy. And then in the capital, you had two lists drawn up, those for the union and those against the union with Serbia. The list for the union with Serbia won handily. The Podgorica Assembly was held in November 1918, and 165 elected representatives gathered. And the Assembly made the decision that Nikola will be dethroned. Montenegro and Serbia will be united as one state under the Karađorđević. That there's going to be a national committee be elected to rule Montenegro in the interim. And unfortunately, at this point, the October Revolution eliminated Russia as their main ally. And so you had an interim government here as they began to negotiate the union with Serbia. It only made sense, of course. So it's called the Great National Assembly of the Serbs in Montenegro. Essentially what they call an ad hoc assembly, formalizing the unification. And unfortunately, it did mean the dethroning of the dynasty. But the whole point of all this has been that this dynasty isn't the traditional Montenegrin one. That wasn't a dynasty at all because it was the bishop ruler. That was overthrown by Danilo. So this dynasty that we're talking about here, Nikola's dynasty, it's insignificant. It is a modern creation, forcing the creation of a modern country. So dethroning them at the time was not seen as a problem. So you created two factions that were known as the Greens and the Whites. The Greens were against the unification. The Whites were in favor of it. So what happened was, even during the war, Nikola refused to sign any capitulation when Austria-Hungary took over Montenegro. And, Serbia signed the Corfu Declaration, accepted by the Allied powers, which set the foundation for what we call Yugoslavia. The Serbian Royal Army then took control of Montenegro from the Central Powers occupation. Because Russia really knocked Austria-Hungary out of the war fairly quickly, but their presence in the Balkans was a separate issue. Don't be fooled by the fact that Russia was a so-called ally, Britain was a so-called ally of Russia. Understand what World War I was. Britain is an oligarchy, of course, is an oligarchy, ruled by a banking clan. Now, you had two opposing states with very different government forms, firmly nationalist and firmly royalist, not under bankers' control, and that was Russia and Prussia. The two of them had a lot in common, not to mention their royal families were very closely related. They had a tremendous trade between the two. There was no way that London could beat both of them. And God forbid if they ever joined together, not to mention Russia expanding into the Balkans, defeating Turkey, and then discovering oil with an exploding population. So you had a firmly nationalist and royalist government, not under bankers' control, which is something that the monarchy made very clear was not going to happen. That was becoming the most powerful empire in the world. World War I was necessary, and of course the secret is how to get Prussia and Russia to fight one another. Now, of course, Germany and Russia to fight one another, even though they're kind of natural allies. The weak point was the Balkans and the Austrians. Because Vienna had German backing, they were incredibly unreasonable to the Serbs. Again, this is a bit off topic, but to believe that the Serbian government had anything to do with the murder of Franz Ferdinand is absurd. Franz Ferdinand was very pro-Slavic. He was opposed to Austrian interference in Slavic. Why did they want to get rid of him? He was not popular in the royal family. No one ever talks about this. Again, off topic, but that's the last person they would want to kill. He was an ally of theirs. Someone else did. But for 50 years, back to the topic, 50 years Montenegro has been preparing for union with Serbia. The only reason they were separated in the first place, well, two reasons. The topography is so different. Montenegro is just one giant mountain, as the name suggests. And that because of the Turkish and Albanian Fanar colonialism. They were separated because Montenegro was free for much longer. But the problem was Nikola wanted to be the ruler of this united state. And because of this, you had internal division. And as I've said, this monarchy had degenerated to a great extent. I mean, compared to today, of course, they're heroes. But at the time, they were not. The negotiations had a lot to do with Montenegro's relation to Serbia. Are they going to be equal partners or not? Well, they're one people. The concept of annexation isn't strange in this case. The only thing that makes imperialism a problem. Why is imperialism an issue? Because one ethnic group is imposing itself on another. As I've said 100 times, if there is no nationalism, there can't be any imperialism. You can't be against imperialism and say that nations don't matter. The whole point of being against imperialism is that one nation has to be independent of another. So, the whites and the greens. The head of the whites, or the main spokesman for the whites, of course, was the church, Metropolitan Gabriel Dozic, who was the movement's chief spokesman. And then he became soon Metropolitan of Montenegro. So here again, you have a firm Orthodox nationalist. His position in all his writings and speeches is based not just on the church, but also ethnicity. The assimilation with Serbia made perfect sense. Spiro Tomanovic was the head of the opposition, although strangely enough, he protested this, saying that his name was put on the green side without his consent. Someone put it there. Oh, and the green and white, it has to do with the voting cards at that assembly. Anyway, of 165 representatives, 160 voted for unification. But of this group that did the voting, you had 56 academics, 6 clergy, 25 local clan leaders from Montenegro, 14 farmers, and 3 represented students, younger people. So this was very much a representative assembly. The Greens were completely defeated. And of course, what does a tiny faction who's defeated badly do? They boycott whatever it is that they've been defeated for in attempts to delegitimize what they're not allowed to get into. But it was clearly representative. But the program of the Greens tried to create this fiction which came about 10, 15 years ago, again, when the European Union satisfied the oligarchic demand, at least 100 years old, to separate Montenegro from Serbia. So they artificially created, the EU essentially artificially created a Montenegrin nation. Well, in this case, there is no such thing. They're Serbian. They're Serbs who live in a very mountainous region on the coast. This is Zeta. This is medieval Serbia. They had an election in Montenegro and they refused to separate from Serbia. Yeah, this is, 15 years ago. So what did the EU do? They said, it wasn't 50%. The very fact that they couldn't get 50% to turn out to make it legitimate in their eyes should tell them something. Not voting is in fact a vote. So they kept having election after election after election, and once they got the numbers they wanted, they said, oh yes, this is 50.0001%. So it was fraud, as always, with these people. But the Green idea, I'm not saying that there weren't healthy forces in the Green idea. But there were 2 major enemies of Yugoslavia, which was seen kind of as a greater Serbia. At the time, it wasn't, but it was seen that way. That was Italy, under the bumbling idiot Mussolini. I say bumbling idiot when it comes to foreign policy. He forced the Germans to rescue him in North Africa, and yet again forced the Germans to rescue him in Greece. Thousands of German soldiers died rescuing this idiot from all the messes he got himself into. And one of the worst things was financing the Ustasha, or the Ustasha, which was not a German creation, it was an Italian creation. And most of them were trained and lived in Italy prior to their being unleashed onto Yugoslavia. Italy and Hungary were very threatened by the unification of the South Slavs. The problem is that they had no religious unification. Without religious unity, there was no unity at all. That was the mistake. An Orthodox union, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Serbia, maybe even Greece, Romania, that makes a lot of sense. But when you bring Catholics in, like the Croats, Catholics and Lutherans in Slovenia, it's a problem. That was the big mistake. But even at this point, the Greens were claiming that, no one's against Yugoslavia. Very few people were against it at the time. But the big concern was the independence, or I should say the autonomy of Montenegro within the Union. Again, which is something that was coming from the outside. So this small faction of the Greens became more and more radical as time went on, and they start getting Italian money. All anti-Yugoslav or anti-Serbian partisans eventually ended up in Italy. So if Mussolini hadn't done enough damage, he organizes them, along with some of the Croat nationalists, into guerrilla bands. Croatia shouldn't have been a part of Yugoslavia in the first place. That's one thing Croats and myself fully agree. I have many Croatian friends. We agree on everything except this. But we definitely agree that Croatia should never have been a part of this. They did, however, vote to enter it. The Italians wanted to undo it. They attempted several failed uprisings, the Greens did. They entered into obscurity, really. Then by the 1920s, they had no more than 1,500 men, and no real ideological unity. So they became the Montenegrin Federalist Party, which makes sense. And they kind of had somewhat of a rational point of view, but as the years went on, they were trounced in elections. The elections of 23, of 1927. And as always, in the countryside, the whites dominated. Only in certain parts of the big cities did you have any Green representation whatsoever. Though Christo Popovic was the Green leader, supported by the Italians and to a lesser extent the Hungarians, quickly changed his position to make it more congenial to Italian interests. So out of nowhere, he demands a completely independent Montenegro. And they became a terrorist cell, just like the Ustasha became. Again, it wasn't that the Croats are this way. It's just that this is Mussolini's interference in something that he knew nothing about and didn't have the strength to really bring to fruition. Now, domestically, I'm not saying anything about Mussolini. But in terms of foreign policy, I despise the guy. Everything he did, he failed. But not just that. Everything he did dragged other countries into his mistakes, especially Germany. People like to complain that the war in Yugoslavia forced Germans to intervene. Well, no, it was Italy's involvement and their failure in the Greek campaign, the complete defeat of the Italian army, that forced Germany to intervene. So the Green forces were very moderate. Then once Mussolini got involved, suddenly now they believe in this phantom Montenegrin nation. The so-called Christmas uprising was doomed to failure. But really never before you have a faction completely and soundly defeated at all levels. The fact that they were financed from abroad just proves that they were a failure. So London and Paris, of course, they're going to support a divided Serbia. But they had to, essentially, Yugoslavia was a fait accompli. But they knew how weak it was because of the introduction of non-Orthodox peoples. Now, Croatia and Slovenia, would that have worked? Of course. That would have made some sense anyway. The fact that that Bulgaria was left out of it is a problem. Yugoslavia didn't make any sense. The reason why many of these people, and they all voted for this, it wasn't just Serbs and Montenegrins and Bosnians. It was the Croats and the Slovenians too. It was either that or to be swallowed up by the coalition of Hungary and Italy, with, to a great extent, financing from London. Don't forget, almost right up until the beginning of the war, Italy was an ally of Britain. I reject the idea that Mussolini was ever really a supporter of Hitler. He didn't like him, and the feeling was certainly mutual. Only at the very beginning of the war, very beginning of the 40s, finally they have some alliance, but that alliance really was Hitler having to save Mussolini from his own stupidity. So the Italian hostility to Serbia and any unification of the Serbs was the only thing that kept the so-called independent Montenegrin idea alive. Now, the Italian infantry backed down very wisely, rather than take on the Serbs using Nicola as a figurehead, but it's only self-interest. The overwhelming majority of Montenegrins wanted unity with the Serbs and the Serbian church, crown, and the nation. But there was a fear of Italian-Hungarian subversion that forced the Serbian army to take up positions around that meeting house where the vote was taken, though having lost the election so badly should have eliminated any argument like that. Fearing foreign attacks, of course the army was involved. That has nothing to do with coercion. Not to mention so many of these areas went over this last few years were ripe for foreign occupation. The unification had to happen quickly. I mentioned, after the Balkan Wars, Montenegro would unify a town and foreign forces would come in and take over, because profit could be made there. So this was the issue right after World War I. The trajectory seems to be that the minute the bishop-monarch unity failed with Danilo II, then you had the church, which was always very important, still is, became more and more relegated. And politics became more secular, became more modern, therefore more class-based, more money-based, more bureaucratic-based, and more connected with foreign capitals. After the October Revolution, we know what that meant. But by the end of 1918, Peter I, Karađorđević, was presented with the Montenegrin crown. The Greens lost. But just like the separation, the so-called independent Montenegro of 600,000 people, which of course has zero independence in the European Union, even though Montenegro has not the slightest right, according to the EU's own rules, for entry. Neither does Romania or Bulgaria, but the point was to keep them away from Russia. Splitting up Serbia has been an obsession from the oligarchs in Europe since at least 1900. Now, of course, because of Mussolini and the Hungarian whites, I've always been a big fan of Horthy for a whole lot of reasons, but he was more or less allied with Mussolini relative to Serbia and Montenegro. The Greens regrouped under the command of the same guy, Krsto Popović, under Italy. Yet again, they created the Lovsten Brigade. But his military work was aimed largely against the partisans, which is fine. But after the war, most of the surviving Green forces joined with the partisans. A handful joined with the Ustaša, a few joined the Chetniks. But it shows you the total ideological void of the group. See, initially, the Federalist Party gathered Montenegrin nationalists. The Green movement, the supporters of the dynasty, the opponents of the loss of Montenegrin statehood, which in and of itself is understandable, wrong, but understandable. But the minute, World War I was over, Yugoslavia is formed, Mussolini consolidates power, 20s and 30s come and go, the party splits into two factions. The first faction was the traditional Federalist Party, but the other is the oligarch belief in the independence of so-called Montenegro. Because of the threat of foreign powers, Yugoslavia had to very quickly be put together as a very large, very strong state to keep it protected. By themselves, these nations, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, they were too small to really fight on their own. And it would be very easy to set them against each other, which was a classic oligarch tactic. But as I mentioned, the population of both countries, Serbia and Montenegro, overwhelmingly accepted this unification. The other issue at the same time, again, not, during the war, during the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian army would have taken the entire country and swallowed it entirely had the Serbian army not saved Montenegro at Ser and Jadra, which forced the Austrians out. The Serbians had shed a lot of blood to save Montenegro, and it was under Generals Jankovic and Pesic, who acted the chief of staff of the Montenegrin Supreme Command. So Serbia now had a right here, not just a moral ethnic right, not just a matter of practical politics, but the blood that they've shed. World War I saves Montenegro only because the Serbian guns yet again drove the Austrians out. Serbia was completely exhausted after 2 Balkan wars. She was broke. She had bled white from these wars against Turkey and then, of course, unfortunately, against Bulgaria. To think that they had any desire for another war, became World War I or the Third Balkan War, I guess you could call it, is absurd. I mean, it's absolute stupidity to believe that Serbia, given everything that they had been through, that they had, they militarily were completely exhausted, that they wanted war, is absolutely laughable. So from the period roughly of 1914, 1935, the results of Montenegrin centralization and modernization become clear. National Socialism was a desperate attempt to regain the unity of the national, religious, and agrarian idea, but because of the threat of subversion, the Soviet Union, liberalism, London, Paris, etc., they needed a very strong state, which is something that kind of makes them semi-modern, but internally it was not. You can't call it a modern ideology because it had a strong state. They were at war. They did what they had to do. This is what this movement was. It's kind of hard to take National Socialism away from the 1930s given the circumstances. The Depression, the slaughter of World War I, the threat of the USSR, not to mention the threat of liberalism, which is actually worse than the threat of the USSR. USSR was clear and out in the open. Liberalism was insidious and acidic. So this assembly that unified the two pieces of Serbia, they didn't meet for fun. They met because Serbia had saved the country. And if nothing could express the unity of the two people more. I remember, it's just not that long ago where the EU tried to split Serbia up and succeeded. Again, most Montenegrins wanting nothing to do with this. A tiny minority accepted the EU, and of course there's a handful of Western educated oligarchs in the cities. So, for a while, supporting Mussolini, afterwards, they support the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Because the Titoists were promising autonomy for Montenegro. The minute they took over, of course, that was thrown away. Even the two parties actually ran in coalition. 1926 and 1927, the Federalist Party agreed to a coalition with the Croatian Peasant Party. There's no ideology here. And the Peasant Democratic Coalition, an attempt to destroy Yugoslavia prior to the war, just shows you that the Green movement was completely irrelevant, ever-changing ideological background that became a laughingstock. There's so many myths about Yugoslavia, Serbia, World War I, and people make up whatever satisfies them. They have no idea what nationalism is. They have no idea what monarchy is. They have no idea why things were done. And they believe everyone's like them. That everyone wants to be right, everyone wants power, everyone wants to assert themselves. Because they're like that, they assume everyone's like that. Because they're corrupt, they assume everyone else is corrupt. Because they don't care about truth, therefore none of us care about truth. That's how they justify themselves. Well, it isn't true. It's far from true. Even something like in 1929, King Alexander created the royal dictatorship. It's pretty rare to find a textbook that doesn't say this was about his own personal power. Like he enjoyed this. This was something for fun. Shows you how bad historians are today. No, the purpose was to keep the Federation together as leftists, Croatian separatists, and Muslims, not to mention the oligarchs from both East and West, were all targeting Belgrade with both Italian and Hungarian assistance. Maybe that has something to do with it. Not to mention that we're in the middle of a depression here. Or actually, I should say the beginning of the depression. And the delegitimation of capitalism. Because of the near destruction of the state, the miserable failure of liberalism, being surrounded by well-armed enemies, all political parties were banned. Well, it makes sense, given that political parties really became the vehicle for ethnic separatism. That certainly happens in pretty much every European country today. Anyone talking about separatism is immediately banned and hounded. Then, of course, you have, it's one thing to have separatists in Croatia, but they became what they were because of Italian and Hungarian assistance and money. And they were plotting against Belgrade. But the Montenegrin Greens occasionally worked with them, but they had no problem working with the communists either. And it shows you how the Marxists usually are. Even in, Tsarist Russia, underground, they were promising all these different groups independence. They promised whatever they needed to promise. The minute they took over, all these promises went out the window. Of course, nothing's ever learned. And nothing's ever learned because no one really does history anymore. They do ideology. So, this is the end of part 2. I'm not finished. This has been a bit more of a eclectic explanation. Because there's a lot going on at once. Essentially what I spoke of here is a disintegration of the medieval Montenegrin idea. On the one hand, it's easy to argue that the conditions of warfare, modernity, external pressure, the modern state itself, the creation of these modern, well-armed empires, really only in the 19th and 20th century had the possibility of ever being totalitarian. You can't have a totalitarian state without modernity, because that requires information technology that didn't exist in the past. Only now, the period we're talking about, is actual oppression possible. Oppression is often really just a monarch imposing himself on elite families. These elite families then go to foreign newspapers and say how awful they have it. No, real oppression is only modern. It's really only 19th, pretty much only 20th century, where everyone is ordered around because the state is just that powerful. Media is controlled. Everyone's dependent on the education system, the factory system, the urban economy, and certainly the rule of money. The medieval Montenegrin idea was very different. They didn't have to become modern because Montenegro was almost impossible to occupy. But an imperialist, and this happened with the British in Ireland, it happens everywhere. The imperialist will go to local elites and say, if you side with us and accept this money economy, this money will pretty much all flow to you, and you can have a title to your lands and power far greater than you ever had before, because now you'll be our ally. Can you imagine how powerful you'd be then? And it works. And all of a sudden, men who were patriarchs of the pastoral society suddenly start being tempted. And all it is an image they have in their mind of what it would be like to be a ruler, what it would be like to be wealthy. All these fantasies. Remember, that's how demons operate. They don't really have control over Orthodox people. They can't. You're sealed. That's what chrismation is. So what can they do? There's only one thing they can do. They can show you images. They could show you fantasies, what it would be like to have a lot of money, or to beat the crap out of your opponents, or to have all these women, whatever it might be. All these fantasies. They never come true, even when you get them. But that's not the point. And this is what Satan showed Christ in the desert. He didn't actually show them all the kingdoms of the world in his hand. They're images. They're fantasies. That's the only power the demons have anymore. But in the age of television, well, that's extreme power. That wasn't at the time. So becoming modern means a violent imposition of this ideology upon people. Currency, modern roads. And it led to Montenegro growing in power at the cost of its own soul. Therefore, the unification movement came into existence, and even Yugoslavia itself was a desperate rearguard effort to try to maintain what they lost without becoming a weak, non-statist society, because they're surrounded by very strong states. Montenegro is impossible to occupy, but it is possible to control from the outside. Modernity, liberalism, capitalism, money can do what the Turkish army over centuries couldn't fail to do. Universalism, cosmopolitanism, the stuff from Metropolitan Cyprian that I mentioned. This comes from the rule of money. The same temptation that I mentioned, the image of absolute power. And others, including many, many good people, have to cozy up to this group of people if you have property. If you're a part of this system, whether you want to be or not. It's all based on images. Images can create fear. Images always have an emotional content to them. So the fantasy is also met by something of fear or excitement or happiness. But these are all myths. They're all stories that you tell yourself. And that's what happens in all of these kids, almost every nation that we deal with on this show. How easy it is to go to people who live in a pre-modern life and say, this is what power you would have if you join with us. But just like the communists, it all goes out the window. The state that Danilo II created was good at the time. But the minute he was gone, others took over and ruled it and used that very same system for something that wasn't in the interest of Montenegrins. And you see here where the Green movement, tiny though it was, existed solely because of foreign influence. And it tore Serbia apart. The EU is still doing it today, using the exact same arguments, and it's the exact same people, different generation, but the exact same group of people. So we're not quite finished. I want to summarize this next week. I end up doing something else because it won't be enough for a full hour. Maybe it will. I don't know. So we'll have the conclusion of this next week. And I thank you all for listening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.